For centuries, our whole understanding of how rural economies work was built on these ideas that seemed, well, perfectly logical, ideas from the biggest names in economics. But what if those brilliant ideas were missing a massive piece of the puzzle? What if the systems that looked totally backwards were actually genius solutions to problems we hadn't even thought of? Okay, let's dive into some old puzzles and find some new truths. So let's take sharecropping. For hundreds of years, this is how people talked about it. I mean, listen to that quote. The mother of misery. It was seen as this just awful exploitative system. And you can kind of see why, right? A tenant farmer does all the work and then has to hand over a huge slice of the pie, like half of it, to a landlord. It just sounds terrible. And that brings us to the big question that had economists scratching their heads for ages. If sharecropping is so obviously bad and inefficient for everybody, why didn't it just die out? How has it been one of the main ways of farming all over the world for centuries? It's a real historical mystery. To solve it, we first have to understand the classic argument against it. For a really long time, the smartest people in the room thought that any landlord using sharecropping was, to put it bluntly, just making a huge mistake. And we're not talking about just anyone. We're talking about the heavyweights, Adam Smith, Alfred Marshall. These are the guys who literally wrote the book on modern economics. And they were all convinced that sharecropping was fundamentally irrational. Okay, so what's wild is how much sense their argument makes. It goes something like this. You're a tenant farmer. You have to buy all the fertilizer, all the seeds. You're paying 100% of those costs. But for all that extra crop you grow because of that fertilizer, you only get to keep half. So you're just not going to bother investing that money unless you know for sure you're going to get at least double your money back. And the result? Farmers don't invest enough, crop yields are way lower than they could be, and the whole system just sputters along inefficiently. So if you're the landlord, this seems like a terrible deal. With sharecropping, you get half of a small, sad little pie. But if you just charged a fixed rent, say $1,000 for the year, no matter what, then the tenant would have every reason in the world to grow as much as possible. The pie would get bigger, and your fixed slice would be bigger too. It seems like a no-brainer. And this is the real head-scratcher. If the math is so simple, why have millions of landlords, for hundreds of years, kept choosing the worst option? Were they all just bad at business? Or, and this is the important part, was the economic model itself missing something absolutely critical? And this is where things get really interesting. Modern economics comes along and just flips the whole problem on its head. Researchers started asking, hey, maybe the landlords aren't the irrational ones. Maybe our theory is just wrong. They found this concept that changes the entire game. The limited liability axiom. It's a simple idea, but it's incredibly powerful. Deep inside many of these contracts is this unspoken rule. If something catastrophic happens, a flood, a drought, whatever, and the crop is totally wiped out, the poor tenant farmer doesn't have to pay. The rent is just forgiven. And this isn't just some abstract theory. This slide is amazing because it shows you the proof. Researchers went back and found actual, real-life contracts from 19th century India that spelled this out word for word. It was a formal, written-down part of the deal. And that's the aha moment. The whole point of the contract was never just about getting the biggest harvest possible in a good year. It was about surviving the bad ones. At its heart, sharecropping is a risk-sharing agreement. When times are good, the landlord gets a piece of the action. But when disaster strikes, the landlord eats the entire loss. And all of a sudden, the whole system looks, well, kind of brilliant. It's basically built-in disaster insurance for the farmers who need it most. It makes the landlord and the tenant partners. They both want to succeed. And it's a perfectly rational way to deal with the insane uncertainty of farming. So that old theory completely missed the idea of risk. And it turns out that wasn't the only puzzle where classical economics kind of overlooked the messy reality of rural life. Another huge mystery was the world of credit and loans. So here's the puzzle. Why were the interest rates from local moneylenders so ridiculously, astronomically high? I'm not talking, 10 or 20%. We're talking rates that could go over 120% a year. It just looks like pure predatory exploitation. Now, the standard explanation was always lender's risk. The theory went that poor farmers are super risky, so lenders have to jack up the rates to cover all the people who'd eventually default. Makes sense, right? Well, except when researchers actually looked at the data, they found that the default rates, while not zero, were nowhere near high enough to explain those crazy interest rates. The numbers just didn't add up. So that led to an even better question. Governments tried to fix this by offering cheap loans through banks, but these programs were a mess of defaults. So if it wasn't the poorest farmers who were the biggest risk, then who on earth wasn't paying back these government loans? Okay, now just look at this slide. This is the raw data from a study in Orissa, India. Let it sink in for a second. Look at that column on the far right, percent of total loan defaulted. You see the folks with the smallest farms up to 2.5 acres? They only account for 11% of the defaulted money. And this chart just makes the shocking truth pop right out at you. It's the largest farmers, the ones with more than 10 acres, who are responsible for a jaw-dropping 62% of all the defaulted loan money. The richest, most powerful people in the village were by far the biggest defaulters. So the old theory wasn't just wrong, it was completely backward. This wasn't about the inability to pay back a loan. It was about having the power to get away with not paying it back. The most influential people got the biggest loans and then just didn't repay them because they knew they could get away with it. And this really gets to the deep, underlying lesson from both of these puzzles. If you really want to understand these economic systems, you have to look past these simple charts of supply and demand. You have to start talking about something much more complicated: power. I mean, think about how we define a free worker. A standard textbook definition like this one says freedom is being able to say yes or no to a job and being able to quit when you want. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But let's see how that works in the real world. A laborer quits his job with a powerful landlord. Okay, legally the landlord can't force him back. But what if that landlord then goes to the only merchant in the village and says, hey, if you sell anything to that guy, you and I are done. Suddenly the laborer is still technically free, but exercising that freedom now means he can't buy food. And that forces you to ask a much bigger question. When power works behind the scenes, through social networks and economic pressure, what does freedom even mean? The line between making a choice and being coerced gets really, really blurry. And really, that's the final takeaway here. Whether you're looking at a farming contract or a loan, the neat and tidy models of old-school economics just fall apart in the real world. They miss the most human thing of all, that complex, messy web of influence, of who owes who and who holds the power. At the end of the day, if you want to understand economics, you have to understand power first.